Easton's dark eyes locked onto the thick, pristine white plaster encasing Gabriella's left arm. The diner was dead quiet. The only sound, the faint hum of the neon sign in the window. He didn't touch the coffee she had just set down. "I asked you a question," Easton said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that usually made grown men beg for their lives. "Who did this to you?" Gabriella avoided his gaze, her trembling hand awkwardly wiping the laminated table with a rag. "I told you. I slipped on the ice behind the alley. It was just a stupid accident." Easton leaned forward, the leather booth groaning under his weight. "Ice doesn't leave defensive bruising on your jaw." Gabriella. The Midnight Owl Diner sat on the very edge of the city's industrial district, a glowing beacon of grease, bad coffee, and desperate souls. For Easton, it was a sanctuary, in a life built on extortion, calculated violence, and the relentless pressure of holding together the city's most formidable underground syndicate. This cracked linoleum floor was the only ground where he didn't have to watch his back. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 2 a.m. He always sat in the back corner booth, facing the door. He always ordered black coffee and a slice of cherry pie, and he was always served by Gabriella. Gabriella was a fixture of the diner, as permanent as the smell of burnt toast and the flickering fluorescent light above the register. She was small, quiet, and possessed a weary kind of grace that Easton had noticed the very first time she poured his coffee. She never treated him like the monster the rest of the city believed him to be. While other patrons would see his tailored black suits, his scarred knuckles, and the grim-faced men waiting in the idling SUV outside, and immediately avert their eyes in terror, Gabriella simply saw a tired man who needed a hot drink. She never asked questions. She never trembled when she handed him his check, but tonight was different. The moment Easton walked through the glass doors, the chime signaling his arrival, the atmosphere felt jagged. The few late-night truckers huddled over their hash browns seemed to shrink into their collars as he passed. Easton ignored them, his heavy footsteps echoing across the floor as he slid into his usual booth. He waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. Usually, Gabriella would have his coffee poured before he even settled in. When she finally emerged from the swinging doors of the kitchen, Easton's sharp, predatory instincts flared. Something was wrong. Her posture, usually straight and resilient despite the grueling shifts, was hitched to one side. She was moving with agonizing slowness, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line. And then he saw it. A heavy, stark, white plaster cast enveloped her left arm, running from her knuckles all the way up past her elbow. A dark, ugly purple bruise blossomed along the line of her jaw, partially hidden by her dark, falling hair. She approached the table awkwardly, balancing the steaming mug of black coffee and the plate of cherry pie entirely in her right hand. Her breathing was shallow, hitched with unspoken pain. As she tried to slide the plate onto the table, her cast bumped against the edge of the formica. A sharp, stifled gasp escaped her lips, her eyes squeezing shut for a fraction of a second as a fresh wave of agony washed over her. Easton didn't move. He didn't reach out to help her. He simply watched her, his mind calculating, assessing the damage. The angle of the cast suggested a severe fracture. The bruise on her jaw was the unmistakable mark of a backhand strike. Someone had hit her. Hard. And someone had broken her arm. The realization settled into Easton's chest like a block of ice. In his world, violence was a currency, a language he spoke fluently. But violence against a civilian, against a woman who spent her nights refilling coffee cups for minimum wage, was a transgression that offended a deep-buried code within him. "Here you go," Gabriella whispered, her voice lacking its usual soft warmth. She wouldn't look at him. She stared stubbornly at the condensation forming on the side of the creamer dispenser. Easton looked at the pie, then slowly up to her face. "Sit down." "I can't. I have tables. There are 3 other people in this diner, and none of them are going to complain," Easton said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the smooth, dangerous cadence that his enemies knew to fear. "Sit down, Gabriella." She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the front counter, where the night manager was pretending to be deeply engrossed in a crossword puzzle. Slowly, painfully, she slid into the booth across from him, cradling her heavy arm against her chest. She looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath her eyes, and her uniform hung loosely on her frame, as if she had lost weight in the mere 3 days since he had last seen her. "What happened?" he asked flatly. "I slipped," she said, reciting the lie with the rigid stiffness of someone who had rehearsed it 100 times in the mirror. "Out by the dumpsters. The ice was black. I went down hard and tried to catch myself." Easton leaned back, steepling his fingers. He let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. He was a man who made his living dissecting lies, finding the cracks in men's souls and exploiting them. Gabriella's lie was amateurish. It was desperate. "Ice breaks wrists," Easton stated quietly, his eyes locked onto hers. "It doesn't leave knuckles bruised. It doesn't leave a defensive contusion on the side of your face. Someone did this to you. I want a name." Gabriella's breath caught. She looked up at him, and for the first time, Easton saw raw, unfiltered terror in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of him. It was the fear of whatever she was hiding. She shook her head rapidly, her right hand gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Please, just drop it. It's none of your business. Let me just do my job." She stood up abruptly, knocking her cast against the table again. She bit her lip to hold back a cry, turned on her heel, and practically fled toward the kitchen. Easton watched her go, the untouched coffee turning cold in front of him. The ice in his chest had hardened into something cold, sharp, and entirely unforgiving. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and tossed it onto the table. Whoever had done this had made a critical mistake. They had broken something that belonged, however tangentially, to his world. And Easton was going to find out exactly who it was. The rain came down in relentless, freezing sheets, turning the city streets into slick ribbons of black glass. Easton sat in the back of his armored town car, the tinted windows shielding him from the bleak morning light. In the driver's seat, his most trusted enforcer, a hulking man who simply went by his title of driver, kept his eyes locked on the rearview mirror. They were parked halfway down the block from a dilapidated brick apartment complex on the Lower East Side. It was 6:00 a.m. Gabriella's shift had ended 2 hours ago. "You're sure this is the address?" Easton asked, his voice a gravelly murmur over the sound of the rain drumming against the roof. "Positive," the driver replied. "4th floor. Walk up. She's been living there for 3 years. Rent is paid in cash, always on time, but she's living hand to mouth. The neighborhood is mostly our territory. Low-level hustle. Some numbers running. Nothing major." Easton stared at the crumbling facade of the building. The idea of Gabriella navigating those dark, narrow stairs with a shattered arm and a bruised face gnawed at something fundamental inside him. He was a man who traded in fear and consequence. He commanded hundreds of men, controlled millions of dollars in illicit revenue, and could make an enemy vanish with a single phone call. Yet, the image of the bruised waitress carrying a tray with one hand consumed his thoughts entirely. He needed to understand the mechanics of this situation. If someone in his territory was hurting innocent people without his explicit permission, it meant there was a leak in the hull of his empire. It meant a lack of discipline. "Watch the door," Easton commanded. 10 minutes later, the heavy iron door of the apartment building groaned open. Gabriella stepped out into the freezing rain. She was wearing a cheap, thin winter coat that offered no real protection against the elements, her left arm bundled awkwardly inside a plastic grocery bag to keep the cast dry. She had the hood pulled low over her face, but Easton could see the tension in her jaw, the way she favored her left side with every step she took. She didn't head toward the bus stop that would take her back to the diner. Instead, she began walking east, moving with a desperate, hurried limp. "Follow her," Easton said. "Keep your distance." The heavy car pulled away from the curb, trailing her like a silent shadow. They followed Gabriella through a labyrinth of gray, washed-out streets. She walked for nearly 2 miles, her breath pluming in the freezing air, her head down against the wind. The sheer physical exertion required to make this trek with a broken arm must have been agonizing. Yet she never stopped. She never even paused to catch her breath. Finally, she turned onto a quiet, tree-lined street bordered by a high wrought iron fence. Behind the fence sat a sprawling, grim-looking stone building. The sign by the gate read, "Street, Jude's Hospice Care, State-Subsidized Facility." Easton's brow furrowed. Why would a waitress barely making minimum wage, burdened with a freshly broken arm, be making a 2-mile trek in the freezing rain to a state-run hospice. Pull over here, Easton ordered. He watched as Gabriella struggled with the heavy front doors of the facility, finally managing to slip inside. He sat in the quiet of the car for a long time, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers the only sound. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, jagged, and entirely confusing. Was she visiting a sick relative? A friend? And how did this connect to the violence inflicted upon her? I can go inside, boss. Ask around. Find out who she's visiting, the driver offered, sensing the heavy gears turning in Easton's mind. No. Easton replied softly. Not yet. We don't spook her. If she's scared enough to lie to my face, she's terrified of whatever is shadowing her. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number he rarely used. It connected directly to his underboss, a man who oversaw the street-level operations and the loan sharking divisions. I need a name, Easton said the moment the line clicked open, skipping any pleasantries. A waitress, works at the Midnight Owl Diner. First name Gabriella. I want to know if she has debt. I want to know if anyone on our payroll has a marker on her. I want her entire financial history on my desk by noon. Consider it done, boss. The voice on the other end replied instantly. Easton hung up, his eyes never leaving the doors of the hospice. The underworld he ruled was a complex ecosystem of predators and prey. He had always prided himself on keeping the violence contained, directed only at those who chose to play the game. But occasionally, a civilian got caught in the crossfire. If one of his own men had put their hands on a woman who had nothing to do with their world, Easton would make an example of them that the streets would whisper about for a decade. He would tear the city apart to find the truth, because the lie she had told him was unraveling, and the threads were leading straight back to his own dark empire. The harsh, fluorescent glare of the diner was a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness of the alleyway behind it. It was 3:00 a.m., an hour past the end of Gabriella's shift. She stepped out of the heavy metal back door, immediately overwhelmed by the biting chill of the winter air. She leaned against the cold brick wall for a moment, her eyes squeezed shut, trying to draw a steady breath. The throbbing in her arm was a relentless, fiery pulse that radiated up to her shoulder and down into her chest. The cheap, over-the-counter painkillers she had swallowed an hour ago were utterly useless against the agony of a shattered ulna. She tightened her grip on her threadbare coat, preparing for the grueling walk to the bus stop, when a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near the dumpsters. Gabriella froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a primal, icy spike of adrenaline flooding her system. She took a step back toward the door, her trembling hand reaching behind her for the handle. I wouldn't do that, Gabby. A voice rasped. It was a voice like grinding gravel, thick with malice. A second figure stepped out from behind a stack of wooden pallets, blocking her path to the street. They were large men, wearing dark leather jackets and flat caps, their faces obscured by the shadows and the rain. But Gabriella knew them. She knew the smell of cheap cigars and stale sweat that clung to them. She knew the heavy, terrifying weight of their presence. Please, Gabriella whispered, her voice cracking. I told you. I need more time. I get paid on Friday. I'll have the installment. The first man, the one who had spoken, stepped closer. The amber light from a distant street lamp caught the cruel curve of his smile. Friday is too late, sweetheart. You missed the payment on the first. The boss is losing his patience. And when the boss loses his patience, the interest goes up. And when the interest goes up, well, things get broken. He gestured lazily toward her heavy white cast. Gabriella instinctively curled her arm tighter against her chest, stepping back until her spine hit the brick wall. The memory of the metal pipe swinging toward her, the sickening crack of the bone, the blinding flash of pain, surged back into her mind, making her stomach heave. I don't have it, she cried softly, tears mingling with the freezing rain on her cheeks. I gave you everything I had last week. Every single cent. I can't bleed a stone. Just give me until Friday, please. The second man chuckled, a hollow, ugly sound. He moved with alarming speed, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He slammed his heavy hand against the brick wall right next to her head, trapping her. You don't get to dictate the terms, waitress. You took the money. You signed the marker. You think 50 grand just vanishes because you cry about it? I didn't take it for me, Gabriella screamed, panic finally breaking through her exhaustion. "You know why I needed it. You know where it goes." "We don't care where it goes," the first man said, stepping into her personal space. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers gripping her bruised jaw. Gabriella whimpered, trying to pull away, but he held her tight, his thumb pressing agonizingly into the purple flesh. "The debt is yours, and the debt is going to be paid. If you don't have the cash by tomorrow night, we're not going to break your arm. We're going to break your legs, and then we're going to take what we're owed out of your skin." "Understood?" Gabriella sobbed, a pathetic, broken sound, and nodded as much as the grip on her jaw would allow. "Good girl," the man sneered. He shoved her back against the wall, releasing her. The two men turned and melted back into the shadows of the alley, leaving Gabriella sliding slowly down the brick wall until she hit the wet pavement. She pulled her knees to her chest, curling her broken arm against her stomach, and wept. She wept for the pain, for the terror, and for the suffocating, impossible weight of the debt that was slowly crushing the life out of her. A sleek black car turned slowly into the mouth of the alley, its headlights sweeping over the wet pavement, the dumpsters, and finally coming to rest on the small, huddled figure shivering on the ground. The car engine idled, a low, powerful purr. The back door opened, and a pair of polished black leather shoes stepped out into the rain. Gabriella looked up, squinting against the blinding headlights. The silhouette of a man stood before her, broad-shouldered, imposing, radiating a quiet, absolute authority. It was Easton. He walked toward her slowly, ignoring the rain soaking his expensive suit. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at her trembling form. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer pity. He simply stated a terrifying, undeniable truth. "Those men," Easton said, his voice softer than the rain but harder than steel. "They work for me." The interior of the private club was suffocatingly warm, smelling of expensive bourbon, aged leather, and the heavy metallic tang of fear. Easton sat at the head of a long mahogany table, the only light in the room coming from a low-hanging chandelier that cast harsh, geometric shadows across the faces of the men standing before him. The club was Easton's fortress, the nerve center of his operations, buried beneath a legitimate high-end restaurant in the city's financial district. Standing across the table from him was his underboss, a man named Russo. Russo was a veteran of the streets, a man who had built a reputation for brutal efficiency. He managed the lower-tier operations, the gambling rings, the protection rackets, and the loan sharking. Usually, Russo was a man brimming with aggressive confidence. Tonight he was sweating profusely, his eyes darting nervously around the dimly lit room. Scattered across the polished wood in front of Easton were several heavy, leather-bound ledgers. They were the physical records of the city's desperation, the names, the numbers, the blood debts owed to Easton's organization. Easton slowly turned a page in the central ledger, the sound of the thick paper rasping loudly in the dead silence of the room. He ran a single, scarred finger down a column of names until he stopped. "Gabriella," Easton said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quietness of his tone was far more terrifying than a shout. A waitress at a diner on 4th Street. No criminal record. No known associates in the life. Barely makes enough to cover rent on a 4th-floor walk-up in the slums. Easton looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Russo with the intensity of a sniper sighting a target. "Explain to me, Russo, how a civilian waitress comes to hold a $50,000 marker with my organization. And explain to me why, when she couldn't make a payment, your enforcers shattered her arm." Russo swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Boss, it's a standard street-level loan. She came to us desperate. Needed the cash fast. No collateral. We slapped a high interest rate on it. Standard procedure for high risk." "I don't care about the procedure," Easton cut in, his voice dropping another degree. "I care about the policy. My policy. We do not lend to civilians who cannot pay. We do not trap working people in debt cycles they cannot escape. We operate with discipline. We prey on the greedy, the ambitious, the players. We do not break the bones of waitresses." Russo wiped his brow with a trembling hand. "She was a special case, boss. The guys working that sector, they saw an opportunity. The interest alone was pulling in a steady stream. When she started missing payments, they had to send a message. If word gets out that we're soft on debt, the whole neighborhood stops paying." Easton stood up slowly. The movement was smooth, deliberate, and entirely predatory. He walked around the large mahogany table, his footsteps silenced by the thick Persian rug. Russo instinctively took a half step back, his body language screaming submission. "You authorized the hit on her arm?" Easton asked, stopping mere inches from Russo. I authorized standard collection methods," Russo stammered, his eyes wide. "I didn't specifically say break her arm. But the enforcers, they have latitude to handle compliance." Easton's hand shot out with terrifying speed. He grabbed Russo by the throat, his thick fingers digging into the man's windpipe. He slammed Russo back against the heavy oak paneling of the wall. The impact rattled the framed pictures hanging nearby. Russo gasped, his hands flying up to claw desperately at Easton's grip, his feet kicking uselessly as Easton lifted him an inch off the ground. "You gave animals a leash in my city," Easton snarled, his face inches from Russo's, the facade of calm completely shattered. "You let them use my name, my fear, to terrorize a woman who pours coffee for a living. You broke the fundamental rule of this syndicate." Easton held him there for 5 agonizing seconds, watching the life begin to drain from Russo's face, before releasing his grip. Russo collapsed to the floor, coughing violently, gasping for air as he scrambled backward. "I want the debt cleared." "Tonight," Easton commanded, looking down at the pathetic figure with absolute disgust. "I want the names of the 2 men who put their hands on her. And if you ever authorize a loan to a civilian outside the parameters of my rules again, I will not choke you, Russo. I will end you. Do you understand?" "Yes, boss." "Yes." "Understood," Russo rasped, clutching his bruised throat. Easton turned away, walking back to the table. He stared down at the ledger, at the name written in neat, clinical ink. Gabriella. $50,000. The revelation had answered one question, but created a much larger, darker one. Why? What could possibly drive a quiet, terrified woman to take on a massive debt from the criminal underworld, knowing the lethal consequences of failure? He closed the ledger with a heavy, definitive thud. There was only one way to find out. He was going to ask her himself. And he was not going to accept a lie. The 4th-floor hallway of Gabriella's apartment building smelled of boiled cabbage and damp rot. The single bulb flickering overhead cast long, twitchy shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Easton stood before her door, Unit 4B. The wood was flimsy, scarred with old scratches, the deadbolt looking entirely inadequate. He raised a hand and knocked firmly. 3 sharp raps. He waited. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of movement inside. A long silence followed. Then the quiet scraping of a chain lock sliding into place. The door cracked open a fraction of an inch. Gabriella's face appeared in the narrow gap. She looked worse than she had in the alley. Her skin was a translucent, sickly pale, the bruise on her jaw having bloomed into a violent mosaic of yellow and deep purple. When she saw Easton standing there, his broad frame filling the hallway, the blood completely drained from her face. She tried to slam the door shut, panic seizing her features. Easton calmly placed his heavy leather shoe against the bottom of the door, stopping it instantly. He didn't push it open forcefully. He simply held it in place, an immovable object. "We need to talk," Easton said quietly. "Leave me alone," Gabriella choked out, her voice high and breathless with terror. "I don't have anything. I told your men I need until Friday. Please, just leave me alone." "I'm not here for the money," Easton replied. "Open the door, Gabriella. I am not going to hurt you." She hesitated, her breathing rapid and shallow. She looked into his eyes, searching for the lie. Easton kept his expression entirely neutral, projecting a calm, steady aura. He knew that to her, he was the devil incarnate. He was the architect of her suffering. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she unlatched the chain and stepped back. Easton pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was tiny, little more than a shoebox. A faded sofa, a small kitchenette with a dripping faucet, and a narrow hallway leading to what he assumed was a bedroom. It was freezing inside, the radiators cold to the touch. But what struck him most was the absolute lack of personal belongings. There were no pictures on the walls, no books, no television. It was the apartment of someone who sold everything they owned to survive. Gabriella retreated to the far wall, backing up until she hit the edge of the kitchen counter. She clutched her cast tightly against her chest, a physical shield against his presence. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice shaking violently. "If you're not here for the money, what do you want? Haven't you taken enough?" Easton remained standing near the door, keeping his distance so as not to crowd her. "I didn't know about the debt, Gabriella. I didn't know my men were holding your marker, and I didn't know they put their hands on you. The men who hurt you operated outside my parameters. They will be dealt with." She let out a bitter, jagged laugh, the sound bordering on hysterical. "Dealt with? You think that matters to me? You think your mob politics change the fact that my arm is shattered? That I can barely work? That I live every single second of my life in absolute terror?" She pointed a trembling finger at him. "You are the boss. It's your money, your name. Don't stand there in your expensive suit and pretend you have clean hands." Her anger was a sudden, fierce flare, breaking through her terror. Easton took the verbal blow without flinching. She was right. He was responsible. "I am not pretending my hands are clean," Easton said softly. "I am here to wipe the slate. The debt is gone. The marker is burned. You don't owe my organization a single dime." Gabriella froze. The anger evaporated, replaced by profound confusion and a deep, ingrained suspicion. She stared at him, searching his face for the trick. In her world, miracles didn't happen, especially not delivered by men like him. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" "Because you didn't deserve what happened to you," Easton stated simply. "But I need something in return." She let out a defeated breath, closing her eyes. "There it is. There's always a price. The price is the truth," Easton commanded, taking a single step forward, his voice dropping into that commanding, inescapable rumble. $50,000. You live in a freezing box. You own nothing. You work diners on the graveyard shift. You didn't spend that money on yourself. Why did you take the loan, Gabriella? What was worth risking your life for?" Gabriella shook her head vehemently, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. No, I can't tell you. If you know, you'll use it against me. You'll take it away. I am the only thing standing between you and the men who broke your arm," Easton said, the harsh reality of his words filling the small room. "I erased the debt, but I need to understand the vulnerability. Tell me the truth, or I walk out that door and let the streets have you back." It was a bluff, a cruel manipulation, but he needed to shatter the wall she had built. Gabriella broke. A deep, agonizing sob tore out of her throat. Her legs gave out, and she slid down the front of the kitchen cabinets. Collapsing onto the cheap linoleum floor, she buried her face in her right hand, her body racked with weeping. Easton closed the distance, kneeling slowly in front of her. The sheer weight of her despair was suffocating. "Who is the money for?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Gabriella looked up, her face flushed, her eyes bloodshot and overflowing. "It's for the hospice," she choked out. "Street Jude's. The state stopped her funding. They were going to throw her out on the street. I couldn't let them do that. I couldn't." Easton felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The pieces were locking together, forming a picture he didn't want to see. "Who?" he asked, a sudden, inexplicable dread washing over him. "Who is in the hospice?" Gabriella took a ragged breath, staring at the floor. "Her name is Eleanor. Eleanor Vance." The world stopped. The sound of the dripping faucet vanished. The cold air in the room ceased to exist. Easton knelt on the cracked linoleum, paralyzed as the name echoed through his skull like a gunshot. Eleanor Vance. His mother. The sterile smell of bleach and medicinal alcohol hit Easton the moment he pushed open the heavy double doors of Street Jude's hospice. The walls were painted a sickly, institutional beige, and the quiet hum of medical machinery provided a morbid soundtrack to the corridors. It was a place designed for waiting for the inevitable end. Easton walked down the hallway with a mechanical stiffness. His mind was a chaotic storm of fragmented memories and violent emotions. He hadn't heard that name in 30 years. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had walked out the door of a crumbling tenement when he was 8 years old, leaving him to the mercy of a violently alcoholic father. The woman who had traded her son for a bus ticket and a promise of something better, only to disappear into the ether. He had spent decades building an empire, hardening his heart into obsidian, fueled by the abandonment that had defined his childhood. He had assumed she was dead. He had hoped she was dead. Gabriella walked slightly ahead of him, her head bowed. She had barely spoken since her breakdown in the apartment. She had simply nodded, her spirit entirely broken. She stopped outside room 412. The door was slightly ajar. She looked back at Easton, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a quiet apprehension. She has advanced dementia, Gabriella whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the fluorescent lights. She has good days and bad days. But she won't know who you are. The past is mostly gone. Easton didn't reply. He placed his hand on the wooden door and pushed it open. The room was small, dimly lit by a single window overlooking an alleyway. In the center of the room, engulfed by the stark white sheets of a hospital bed, lay a frail, impossibly small woman. Her hair was thin and wispy white. Her skin resembling delicate parchment stretched tightly over bone. She was staring blankly at the ceiling, her chest rising and falling with shallow, rattling breaths. Easton stood frozen in the doorway. He searched the withered face of the old woman, looking for the phantom of the mother who had abandoned him. He saw the curve of her cheek. The realization slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. It was her, broken, dying, and entirely pathetic. The towering figure of betrayal he had carried in his mind for 3 decades was reduced to a fragile shell waiting for the end. Gabriella moved past him, entering the room with a practiced, gentle grace despite her heavy cast. She pulled a plastic chair close to the bed and sat down. She reached out with her good hand, softly taking the old woman's frail, skeletal fingers. "Hi, Eleanor," Gabriella said softly, her voice adopting a warm, soothing cadence that Easton had never heard before. "I'm here. I brought some fresh water." The old woman's head slowly turned. Her cloudy, faded eyes struggled to focus on Gabriella's face. A weak, trembling smile touched her pale lips. "My angel?" Eleanor rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping against stone. "You came back. I thought you left me." "I would never leave you, Eleanor," Gabriella said, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm right here." Easton watched the exchange, his chest tightening until he could barely breathe. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. He watched this waitress, a woman who lived in poverty, a woman who had allowed mob enforcers to shatter her bones, gently stroke the hair of the mother who had thrown him away like garbage. "Why?" Easton finally spoke, his voice a harsh, fractured whisper that shattered the quiet of the room. He stepped forward, looming over the foot of the bed. "Why are you doing this?" "Why her?" Gabriella looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I met her 2 years ago," Gabriella explained quietly. "I was volunteering here on weekends. She had no one, no visitors, no family listed on her charts. The state was going to transfer her to a ward facility, a warehouse for the dying. It's a horrible place. I couldn't let her go there alone. So, I started paying for a private room. I started covering the extra care. But the costs kept going up, and my shifts at the diner weren't enough." Easton stared at Gabriella, the devastating truth crashing over him in relentless waves. She had taken a $50,000 mob loan. She had faced down violent thugs in dark alleys. She had her arm brutally broken. And she had endured it all in absolute silence, entirely to protect the mother who had abandoned him. Gabriella had bled for the ghost of his past. Eleanor shifted weakly in the bed, her cloudy eyes finally drifting to the large, dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. She squinted, her brow furrowing in confusion. Who is the big man?" she croaked. "Is he a doctor?" Easton looked down at the woman who had birthed him. He waited for the anger, the bitter rage that had fueled his entire life, to rise up and consume him, but there was only a profound, hollow sadness. "No, Eleanor," Gabriella said softly, gently squeezing the old woman's hand. "He's just a friend. He's here to help." Easton turned away, unable to look at them any longer. The walls of the room were closing in. He walked out the door, his heavy footsteps echoing down the sterile hallway, leaving the waitress and the dying woman behind. His empire, his power, his wealth, all of it felt utterly meaningless in the face of the staggering, selfless sacrifice he had just witnessed, and the guilt of what his men had done to Gabriella threatened to tear him apart from the inside out. The rain had stopped, leaving the city locked in a damp, freezing stillness. Easton sat alone in the back of his armored car, parked across the street from the hospice. Hours had passed. The sky was beginning to bleed from pitch black into the bruised purple of early dawn. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. The driver sat motionless in the front seat, sensing the volatile, dangerous energy radiating from the back. Easton's mind was a war zone. The revelation inside room 412 had stripped away the armor he had worn for 30 years. He had spent his life accumulating power to ensure he would never be helpless again, to ensure he would never be the abandoned, terrified boy shivering in a cold apartment. He had built a fortress of intimidation and control. Yet, a waitress earning tips had shown more strength, more profound courage than he ever had. Gabriella had stepped into the void his mother had created. She had taken on the burden of a stranger's dying days. And how had Easton's world repaid her? By terrorizing her. By breaking her. By forcing her to kneel in the dirt of a filthy alleyway. He pulled a silver flask from his coat pocket, unscrewed the cap, and took a long, burning pull of whiskey. The alcohol did nothing to numb the sharp edges of his guilt. The men who had hurt Gabriella Russo, the enforcers, the entire predatory system he had allowed to fester beneath him, they were a reflection of his own darkness. He had created an ecosystem where wolves roamed free, believing he could control who they bit. He had been wrong. He closed his eyes, visualizing the heavy plaster cast on Gabriella's arm, the terrifying bruise coloring her jaw. He visualized the fragile, dying woman in the bed, clutching Gabriella's hand like a lifeline. A profound shift occurred deep within Easton's core. The cold, calculating Mafia boss died in the back of that car, replaced by a man demanding absolute righteous consequence. He was not just going to erase Gabriella's debt. He was going to eradicate the disease that had infected his organization. He was going to burn the rot out. Easton opened his eyes. The darkness within them had sharpened into a cold, terrifying clarity. "Start the car," Easton commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. The driver instantly keyed the ignition, the powerful engine roaring to life. "Where to, boss?" "The shipping yards," Easton said. "Pier 44. Call Russo. Tell him I want him there in 20 minutes. Tell him to bring the 2 enforcers who hold the 4th Street territory. Tell him if anyone is late, they don't need to show up at all." "Boss." The driver hesitated, looking in the rearview mirror. He recognized the tone. It was the tone Easton used before a war began. "Are we cleaning house?" "We're cutting out a cancer," Easton replied flatly. "Drive." The warehouse at Pier 44 was vast, cavernous, and entirely empty save for the echoing sound of water slapping against the pylons outside. It was a space Easton used exclusively for problems that required permanent solutions. When Easton arrived, Russo and 2 massive, heavily tattooed enforcers were already waiting. They stood near a stack of shipping crates, shifting nervously under the harsh glare of a solitary halogen work light suspended from the rafters. Easton walked toward them slowly, the heavy thud of his boots echoing through the cavernous space. He didn't bring his usual security detail. He didn't need them. The sheer, overwhelming force of his presence was enough to make the 3 men visibly shrink. "Boss," Russo said, taking a tentative step forward, his voice tight with anxiety. "You called us down here. Is there a problem with a shipment?" Easton stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the 2 enforcers. They were the ones. He could smell the cheap cigars, the stale arrogance of men who made their living terrifying the weak. "You 2, Easton said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded absolute obedience. "You work the 4th Street collections. You held the marker on the waitress from the diner." The men exchanged a nervous glance. The taller of the 2, a man with a scarred lip, nodded slowly. "Yeah, boss. That's our sector. Like Russo said, we handled the compliance issue. You broke her arm," Easton stated. A statement of fact, not a question. "She was resisting payment," the enforcer defended, standing a little taller, trying to project strength. "Standard procedure. Send a message to the neighborhood." Easton moved with a terrifying, explosive speed that belied his size. Before the enforcer could blink, Easton crossed the distance, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with the sound of a cracking whip. The enforcer's head snapped back, his eyes rolling white as he collapsed backward into the shipping crates, unconscious before he hit the ground. The second enforcer yelled, reaching for a weapon tucked into his waistband, but Easton was already there. He grabbed the man by the lapels of his leather jacket, lifting him bodily off the concrete floor. and slammed him viciously against the steel side of a container. The impact knocked the wind out of the man in a violent rush. Easton pinned him there, his forearm pressed crushing against the man's throat. Russo stumbled backward, his face entirely devoid of color, trembling violently. "Listen to me very carefully," Easton hissed, his face inches from the choking enforcer, his voice filled with a demonic fury. "That woman you touched was under my protection. The money she owed was a debt incurred to care for my own blood. And you, in your infinite, pathetic ignorance, decided to break her." Easton released his grip, letting the gasping man crumple to the floor next to his unconscious partner. Easton turned his dark, wrathful gaze onto Russo. The underboss fell to his knees, raising his hands in a desperate plea for mercy. "Boss, I swear to God, I didn't know," Russo cried, tears spilling down his face. "I didn't know she was connected to you. I wouldn't have authorized it. Have mercy." "Ignorance is not an excuse for breaking the code, Russo," Easton said, his voice returning to that terrifying, calm rumble. "You built a system of cruelty beneath me. You exploited the desperate. You broke the innocent. You poisoned my city." Easton reached inside his coat, pulling out the heavy, leather-bound ledger he had taken from the club. He tossed it onto the concrete floor at Russo's knees. "This division of our organization is finished," Easton declared, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "The loan sharking, the street-level extortion. It ends tonight. You will dismantle the entire network by morning. Every marker is forgiven. Every debt is erased. You will burn the books. And you will inform every man under your command that if they ever lay a hand on a civilian again, I will not call them to a warehouse. I will bury them where they stand." Russo stared at the ledger, then up at Easton, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of the order. "Boss, that's millions of dollars. The families won't understand. The captains will revolt." "Let them," Easton said coldly. "If they want a war over the right to break the bones of waitresses, they can come to me. But you are out, Russo. Pack your things. Leave the city. If I see your face in my territory after sunrise, you're a dead man." Easton turned and walked away, leaving the broken men in the harsh glare of the work light. The cancer was cut out. The empire would bleed, it would fracture, and it would likely plunge into chaos. But as Easton walked out into the freezing dawn air, a strange, unfamiliar sensation settled in his chest. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a monster. He felt clean. The fallout was immediate and chaotic. For the next 3 weeks, Easton's world was a maelstrom of violent restructuring and internal warfare. Word spread quickly through the criminal underground that Easton had lost his nerve, that he was dismantling his most profitable, albeit predatory divisions. Ambitious captains challenged his authority. Rival syndicates probed his borders, sensing weakness. Easton met every challenge with overwhelming, ruthless precision. He didn't engage in prolonged negotiations. He crushed the rebellions within his ranks, stripping power from anyone who questioned the new mandate. He fortified his legitimate businesses, the shipping lanes, the construction contracts, the high-end clubs, and completely severed the parasitic tentacles that had preyed on the city's most vulnerable. It was a brutal, exhausting purge, costing him millions in revenue and forcing him to sleep with a loaded weapon on his nightstand. But he didn't waver. The memory of Gabriella's broken arm and the fragile woman in the hospice bed fueled a relentless, driving purpose. He hadn't seen Gabriella since that night at Street Jude's. He had ordered his men to stay far away from the Midnight Owl diner and her apartment building. He knew his presence was a source of trauma for her, a terrifying reminder of the violence that had nearly destroyed her life. He wanted to give her space to heal, to realize that the threat was genuinely gone, but he hadn't abandoned the situation. Easton had quietly utilized his network of legitimate lawyers and accountants to intervene at the hospice. A mysterious, anonymous donation, a trust fund heavily endowed and ironclad, had been established in Eleanor Vance's name. It guaranteed the absolute highest tier of private medical care, round-the-clock nursing, and complete financial security for the remainder of her days. The state was removed from the equation entirely. On a cold, clear Tuesday night, nearly a month after the incident in the alley, Easton finally found the quiet he had been fighting for. The internal wars had settled. The new hierarchy of his organization, stripped of its cruelest elements, was functioning under his absolute rule. The city's underworld had learned a terrifying lesson. Easton was not weak. He was simply evolving into something far more dangerous, a predator with a moral compass. It was 2 a.m. Easton sat in the back of his town car, watching the neon sign of the Midnight Owl Diner flicker against the night sky. The familiar knot of anticipation and anxiety tightened in his chest. He didn't know if she still worked there. He didn't know if she would even look at him. "Wait here," Easton told the driver. He stepped out of the car, the crisp winter air stinging his face. He walked up to the glass doors, the chime ringing out sharply as he pushed them open. The diner was mostly empty, save for a few exhausted shift workers hunched over their coffees. The smell of grease and burnt coffee hit him like a wave of nostalgia. He walked toward his usual booth in the back corner. As he slid into the cracked leather seat, the swinging doors of the kitchen pushed open. Gabriella stepped out. Easton's breath caught in his throat. The heavy, restrictive white plaster cast was gone. In its place was a smaller, dark medical brace stabilizing her wrist and forearm. The violent bruising on her jaw had faded to a faint, yellowish shadow, easily hidden by the dim lighting. She looked tired, as she always did. But the suffocating aura of terror that had clung to her like a shroud was entirely absent. She stood a little taller. The nervous tremor in her hands was gone. She stopped mid-stride when she saw him sitting in the corner booth. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. Easton kept his hands flat on the table, projecting absolute stillness, waiting for her to flee, waiting for the fear to return to her eyes. Instead, Gabriella took a slow, deep breath, grabbed a ceramic mug and the glass coffee pot, and walked purposefully toward his table. She stopped next to the booth, pouring the steaming black coffee into his mug with her good hand. She didn't spill a drop. "The debt collectors never came back," Gabriella said quietly, her voice steady, her eyes focused on the coffee pouring into the mug. "The marker is gone. The landlord even said someone paid my rent for the next year in cash. Anonymous." Easton didn't say a word. He looked up at her, waiting. Gabriella set the coffee pot down. She looked directly into Easton's dark eyes. There was no fear there anymore. Only a profound, weary understanding. "And the hospice," she continued, her voice softening. "The administrator told me a private trust was established for Eleanor. Paid in full. The best care in the city. They said I don't have to worry about the bills ever again. She deserves comfort in her final days," Easton said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of its usual intimidating edge. "And you deserve to live without fear." Gabriella looked at the medical brace on her arm, tracing the Velcro straps with her fingers. "I didn't know she was your mother," she whispered. "She never spoke of family, only of regrets." "I didn't know she was alive until you showed me," Easton admitted, the vulnerability of the confession feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. "I spent my life building an empire because of what she did to me, and in the end, it was you, a stranger, who showed her the mercy I couldn't find in myself." He reached into his pocket and placed a single, pristine $100 bill on the table, sliding it toward her. Gabriella looked at the money, then back up at him. A small, genuine, and incredibly tired smile touched the corners of her lips. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. "I'll get your cherry pie," she said softly. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her steps lighter, the burden of the world finally lifted from her shoulders. Easton watched her go, the steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. The empire he ruled was still dark, still dangerous, but sitting in the flickering light of the Midnight Owl Diner, the shadows felt just a little bit further away. He had broken his world apart to fix the damage he had caused her, and as he took his first sip of the bitter coffee, he knew, with absolute certainty, that it was the best thing he had ever done. Winter bled slowly into a hesitant, gray spring. The snow melted into muddy slush along the gutters of the city, and the biting wind lost some of its sharpest teeth. The seismic shifts within Easton's organization had stabilized into a new, rigid order. The streets were quieter. The fear that usually permeated the lower-income neighborhoods, the fear of loan sharks and aggressive enforcers, had noticeably receded. Easton ruled with an iron fist, but the fist was no longer swinging wildly into the dark. His routine at the Midnight Owl Diner remained unchanged. Tuesdays and Thursdays, exactly at 2 a.m. He sat in the back booth, and Gabriella served his coffee and cherry pie, but the dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted. The oppressive, terrifying silence that used to hang over their interactions was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, comfortable camaraderie. They rarely spoke of the criminal underworld or the violence that had brought them together. Instead, in the quiet hours of the morning, when the diner was empty, they spoke of small things. Easton learned that Gabriella had wanted to be a teacher before life had derailed her plans. He learned she hated the smell of the industrial fryers but loved the quiet of the city before the sun came up. In turn, Gabriella learned that the terrifying Mafia boss had a surprising, encyclopedic knowledge of classic architecture, and that he drank his coffee black not out of preference, but because it was a habit formed when he couldn't afford milk. The medical brace eventually came off Gabriella's arm, leaving behind a faint stiffness that she barely noticed anymore. The shadows under her eyes lightened. She started taking night classes at the community college, funded by the money she no longer had to surrender to Easton's former enforcers. One rainy Thursday night, the diner was completely deserted. The night manager was asleep in the back office. Gabriella slid into the booth across from Easton, holding her own mug of tea. It was a familiarity she never would have dared attempt a few months prior. "I went to see Eleanor today," Gabriella said softly, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic mug. Easton paused, his fork hovering over his pie. He slowly lowered it to the plate. He still hadn't returned to the hospice. The psychological barrier of facing his mother, of confronting the deep-seated trauma of his childhood, was a wall he hadn't yet been able to scale. He ensured she was cared for financially, but physically, he remained a ghost. "How is she?" Easton asked, his voice tight. Slipping, Gabriella replied honestly, her eyes carrying a sad, gentle weight. "The doctors say it won't be long now. Her heart is failing, but she's comfortable. She's not in pain." Gabriella paused, looking down at her tea. She asked about the big man. Easton looked away, staring out the rain-streaked window at the empty street. "She doesn't know who I am, Gabriella. She's looking for a stranger. She's looking for the man who paid her bills, not the son she abandoned." "Does it matter?" Gabriella asked quietly. Easton turned back to her, a flare of defensive anger rising in his chest, but it dissolved the moment he met her gaze. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a profound empathy. "You forgave the men who broke your arm," Easton stated, leaning back in the booth. "You forgave the organization that terrorized you. You sit here and drink tea with the man who ran that organization. Why is it so easy for you to let go of the anger?" "It wasn't easy," Gabriella said, a faint, rueful smile touching her lips. "I was terrified of you. I hated you for a long time. But carrying that anger, it's exhausting. It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. When I saw what you did, how you tore apart your own world to make things right for me, a nobody waitress, I realized that people can change. You changed. You stepped out of the darkness." She reached across the table, her fingers lightly brushing against the scarred knuckles of his hand. It was a fleeting, astonishingly intimate gesture. "Eleanor is dying, Easton," she said, using his first name with a quiet reverence. "She made terrible mistakes. She broke you, but if you let her die without seeing you one last time, that broken piece inside you is never going to heal. You'll carry the ghost of her abandonment for the rest of your life. You have the power to close the circle. You just have to be brave enough to walk into the room." Easton stared at her hand as she pulled it back. The words struck deep, resonating with a truth he had been desperately trying to ignore. He had conquered the city's underworld. He had faced down armed men without flinching. But the thought of walking back into room 412 terrified him more than death itself. He looked at Gabriella, this resilient, extraordinary woman who had suffered for his family's sins and emerged with her humanity entirely intact. If she could face her monsters, perhaps he could face his. Easton pulled a $100 bill from his pocket and laid it on the table. He stood up, towering over the booth. The heavy mantle of his authority seemed to settle back onto his shoulders, but the ruthless edge was gone. "My car is outside," Easton said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He looked down at her. "Will you come with me?" Gabriella looked up at him, a profound understanding passing between them in the quiet diner. She didn't hesitate. She untied her apron, draped it over the chair, and stood up. "Yes," she said. "I'll come with you." Together they walked out of the diner and into the rainy night. The sleek black car was waiting at the curb. As the driver pulled away, heading toward the hospice, Easton didn't look out the window at the city he ruled. He looked straight ahead, bracing himself for the hardest battle of his life. But for the first time in 30 years, as he sat in the dark of the car, he didn't feel entirely alone. The true measure of power isn't found in the fear we instill in others, but in the profound courage it takes to confront our own brokenness and heal the damage we've caused. Easton's transformative journey proves that redemption is always possible when we actively choose compassion over cruelty. Sometimes, the most unexpected people, like a quiet waitress with a broken arm, carry the light needed to guide us out of our darkest shadows. If this emotional journey of hidden truths, sacrifice, and unexpected redemption moved you, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who loves intense, real-life dramatic storytelling, and subscribe to the channel for more deep, cinematic narratives. Your support means everything,